Pasco County, Florida, a rapidly growing bedroom community to the northwest of Tampa. Pasco County is well known as a haven for boaters, fishermen, and tourists. Many of the county's residents commute between Pasco County and the larger metropolitan areas to the south. For most who pass through the county, its most striking feature might be U.S. Highway 19, an 8-lane swath of concrete that runs through Pasco County from the north to the south, through highly populated Pinellas County, before reaching the Sunshine Skyway. But hidden a few feet away from this raging highway, an adventurous soul can step into history. Pioneers, Indians, gamblers, gangsters, ghosts, movie stars, con artists, and pirates? There's more to Pasco County than US 19. Pasco County was not always just another suburb on the road to Tampa. In the early 1800s, Indians far outnumbered settlers in Pasco County. The Tocobaga tribe lived along the vast Gulf Coast of Florida when the Spanish arrived during the 1500s. The Tocobaga depended on the natural resources of the heavily forested coastline for their culture and sustenance. They were sworn enemies with another tribe on the coast, the Calusas, further to the south. But their destinies would ultimately become one. The Tocobaga, when not battling the Calusa, spent their time making pottery and living off the rich resources provided by Pasco County's rolling river valleys in the Gulf of Mexico. The Tocobagas also built dozens, perhaps hundreds of earthen mounds along the coast. Some believe they're burial grounds. Others suggest a ceremonial or a religious aspect. It is unlikely that we will ever know the truth. Most of the mounds have been removed, destroyed by time and weather, or the ravages of mankind. For the Tocobagas, their first encounter with Europeans may have been rather surprising. In about 1513, a fleet of Spanish ships rounded the tip of southern Florida and sailed toward what is now called Pasco County. The adventurers, led by Ponce de Leon, were looking for the legendary island of Bimini, reputed to be home to the Fountain of Youth. It is likely that a few brave Tocobagas watched with amazement as the huge war galleon sailed past the Cody River in western Pasco County.
When De Soto landed, they actually took the king of the Calusa Indians, King Carlos, on a boat. And there's a written record where they sailed into Tampa Bay, and Carlos tried to convince De Soto to attack the chief Tocobaga.
In the 1700s and early 1800s, Florida, and consequently Pasco County, rapidly changed hands as nations across the Atlantic battled for territory in the New World. Britain, France, Spain, and the youthful United States all laid claim to the land. At one point, Florida was two colonies, West Florida and East Florida, both under control of the British Empire and loyal to England during the Revolutionary War. Florida was bought, sold, fought for, and seized or occupied 9 times before the dispute resulted in Spain selling Florida to the United States for $5 million. By 1830, Florida remained part of a much larger territory that spanned from the Atlantic Ocean all the way to the Mississippi River. The entire territory's residents at this time numbered less than 35,000 settlers and an unknown number of native peoples and slaves. What is known is that the native population was rapidly dwindling. The Tocobagas and their enemies to the south, the Calusa, had lived in conflict for generations. But all of their strength and courage would prove no match for the diseases Europeans brought with them. Over a few decades, their tribal numbers had dwindled at an alarming rate as smallpox and other introduced diseases decimated the tribes. Finally, given no choice, the tribes united to become what many believe is the modern-day Seminole Nation. In 1832, the United States government created a reservation for the Seminoles. However, the government was not willing to consider this treaty to be binding. The land might have to be surrendered at any time. The Seminoles, angered by the deceit, launched an offensive in 1835. What would later become known as the Second Seminole War resulted in off-and-on skirmishes and some fierce fighting until 1842. During the conflict, the Seminoles attacked a detachment of 100 soldiers led by Major Francis Dade, following a march through what is now Pasco County. Only 4 soldiers survived by playing dead. The hostilities continued for 7 long years, until the Indians finally capitulated. Florida entered the Union in 1845. Occasional skirmishes continued into the 1850s until the government, wishing to attract settlers to the young state, forced the remaining Seminoles in Pasco County onto a new reservation far from Florida. Dry heat and harsh winters greeted the former Calusas and Tocobaga at their new home in Oklahoma. A small band of Seminoles refused to surrender and retreated to the Everglades. By 1870, the state counted nearly 190,000 residents, with increasing numbers arriving, despite the fact that to reach Florida, they had to travel across the South, recently decimated by the Civil War. When the Civil War broke out, Florida was the third state to secede from the Union, a fact often overlooked by many historians. Florida became an independent nation. When it did join the Confederacy, Florida had the least population of all the Confederate states. Almost half its population was African Americans. Florida, and particularly the west coast of Florida, had little to offer in terms of industrial, strategic, or agricultural importance. Florida, though, was home to a large number of slaves. One census indicates that in 1850, areas just to the north of modern-day Pasco County had more than 2 slaves for every white. No exact count is available for Pasco County at that time. While it remains a touchy subject even today, slavery was indeed an accepted ideal in this area. One commodity Florida possessed was very important to the Confederate Army and to local residents: salt. During the 1800s, without refrigeration, salt was used to preserve food for extended periods of time. Local residents would come to coastal areas once a year to boil seawater. The settlers would collect enough salt to supply their families for the following year. However, some entrepreneurs recognized a more efficient method and took up residence farther inland. Salt springs spewed from several areas in the state, putting out a mixture that contained far more salt than seawater, making the boiling process much easier and less time-consuming. The true genesis of what would become Pasco County began in the mid-1800s on the Pitlachiskoti River, when David and Henry Hope moved from the community that later became Brooksville to build a salt works on the river. When the Civil War erupted, the Hopes supplied the Confederacy with vast amounts of salt, which after being processed was sent by wagon or boat to supply ships waiting off the coast. Another commodity Florida supplied was beef. Prior to the war, much of Florida's beef was shipped to Cuba. During the war, nearly all of it was sent up supply lines for the troops battling the Union. It is important to note that not all Floridians were loyal to the Confederacy, and African Americans fought for both the Union and the Confederacy. Many of Florida's seaports were in fact controlled by the Union. The salt works became known as Hopeville and appeared on maps of the area for many years after the war, before being swallowed by the city of Port Richey and its rapid expansion. After the war, Florida's black slaves found themselves free, but freedom did have a cost. Many of the former slaves found work in the orange groves and as manual laborers. Others did not, and simply moved. Being a former slave during this time period often meant working for the same people who would own the slaves prior to the end of the conflict.
Pine Hill was the black community. Those blacks that lived here. A small number of blacks, but of course all living together. And you know, the blacks provided the labor for clearing the land. If you talk to some of the old-timers, they will tell you that their daddies were the land clearers. So
little is known about black culture in Pasco County during the late 1800s, but there are indications the former slaves tried to better themselves. By the 1930s, and likely for years before, a school for black children was in operation in New Port Richey. African Americans migrated to the Pine Hill section during the 1920s. The final school built for blacks before integration was the Booker T. Washington School on Pine Hill Road. Prior to integration, after graduation from Booker T. Washington, African American children would have to make their way to Tarpon Springs in Pinellas County to meet with other black children, and then make their way to Clearwater to attend a segregated high school. One fact that is known is that former slaves did not have a cemetery to bury their dead. When someone died, they were forced to either bury them in the wilderness or to make the 8-mile funeral trek to the only black cemetery in the area. Rose Hill Cemetery, 8 miles away in Tarpon Springs, was accessible only by making an arduous trip through rough trails and overgrown paths cutting through the dense pine trees. The cemetery was likely constructed in the 1880s. Winding past the meticulously maintained whites-only Cicadia Cemetery, the funeral procession would come to a halt at the sparsely vegetated and worn Rose Hill Cemetery. Captain Aaron Richey, one of the founders of Port Richey, and other dignitaries from all over the area were laid to rest in granite and marble crypts at Cicadia. But the former slaves were laid to rest in the ill-kept field for blacks only. The most famous resident of Rose Hill Cemetery is a former slave named Richard Quarles, who fought for the Confederacy during the Civil War, and later became one of the area's most prominent black citizens. Following the war, illiterate, he took the name Christopher Columbus, which he could easily spell. The end of the Civil War began a time of peace and expansion for Pasco County. However, the same could not be said for the state of Florida. Before synthetic sponges were available, the world's greatest supply of natural sponges was located off the Gulf Coast of Florida. Fierce competition ensued for sponging grounds between the Key Westers and the Tarpon Springs Greeks. Some say the competition was so fierce to inspire violence and piracy. While no exact records exist, it is likely there were disputes about this vast source of wealth. By the early 1880s, Florida was on the brink of financial disaster after overextending itself on railway expansion. Bankruptcy loomed as the governor, William Bloxam, desperately sought a solution. That solution, later to be known as Bloxam's Folly, would result in one of the first large-scale land scams Florida would later become famous for. Governor Bloxam, to keep the state solvent, made arrangements to sell 4 million acres of land, some in what is now Pasco and Pinellas counties, for 25 cents an acre. The sale netted the state $1 million. Hamilton Diston, son of a wealthy manufacturer from Philadelphia, had promised the state when he purchased the land that he would make thousands of acres of swampland into residential lots. But this time, the trick was on the state, as it was soon discovered that the supposed swampland was actually mostly comprised of high and dry prime land for development. At that moment, Hamilton Diston became the largest landowner in the U.S. Diston surveyed the land and platted out the town of Tarpon Springs in Pinellas County. Diston sent former governor of the Arizona Territory, Anson Safford, to Tarpon Springs. Within a short time, 2 hotels, a pier, and a stage line to Tampa had been established. After clearing and filling the land, Diston began an immense marketing campaign to lure visitors from the north to occupy the hotels and homes in Tarpon Springs.
Turns out that Diston got a lot of good prime area, I mean, especially Pinellas County and Tarpon Springs southward to St. Pete. And of course he did get some Everglades and also did come up this way here into Pasco County. But he got the better end of the deal, no doubt, at 25 cents an acre.
Most of the rest of the land he retained as a large gentleman's cattle ranch and sugar empire. But in June of 1893, the stock market crashed. Diston found himself unable to maintain the ranch, and the money from his father in Philadelphia began to falter. By 1894, the ranch was in disarray, the economy still a shambles, and Diston was ruined. Hamilton Diston killed himself in Philadelphia in June of 1896, leaving a legacy of promises and swampland. Diston was one of many speculators who bought and sold land in the area. Others fared slightly better. In 1883, the Florida Land Improvement Company purchased several 100,000 acres in the area, also at 25 cents per acre, a remarkable price at the time. Remarkable not because it was considered inexpensive, but rather the opposite. Prior to the state's financial problems, it was nearly impossible to get anyone to buy land in Florida at any price. The Florida Land Improvement Company took on a less financially risky plan than Diston. While Hamilton Diston was planning his extravagant resort community, the Florida Land Company quietly looked for buyers to take the land off their hands, at a profit, of course. Over the next 20 years, most of the land in Pasco County changed hands a half-dozen times to ever larger land developers, offering ever larger prices, and finally to a series of lumber companies. In 1883, Aaron Richey moved his young family from Missouri to the mouth of the Pittsburgh River and established a general store and small shipping company. Richey also began a freight shipping business, employing a schooner that he sailed to the Cedar Keys to supply his store and local residents with vegetables and other necessary goods. Thus he earned the honorary title, Captain Richey. For 8 long years, the family lived on the banks of the river, which was a particularly difficult hardship for Richie's wife and daughter. Sometimes months would elapse without the comfort of female companionship.
He was in business for himself. He was a drover. He supplied goods to the Confederate Army, and as many people, maybe you could consider him a profiteer, but he provided a service by supplying goods to the Army.
Aaron Richey also established a post office and named it Port Richey. As the coastal area became known for rich resources and an excellent site for growing citrus, more settlers streamed in. Rising land values inspired Captain Richey to sell much of his land, working with the Safford Land Company, headed by former Arizona Governor Safford. The land was platted for homes, and the city of Port Richey was born. Several miles to the northwest, the town of 5A sprang into existence with the construction of a gigantic lumber operation. The town, named 5A because all 5 principal owners had last names that began with A, was one of the largest lumber communities in the state at the time it began operation in 1904. The town quickly became the center of local culture, boasting clubhouses, a railway, hotels, and shopping.
The sawmill company was going out of business because they had just completely timbered all of the land, and they just closed down. It took them about a dozen years or so to do that.
In 1912, the lumber supply exhausted, the sawmill closed, and the town of over 2,000 people slowly receded into the depths of history. Much of Pasco County was later replanted. If you drive through the area, look for tall pine trees planted evenly, in perfect rows. In 1911, W.E. Guilford and P.L. Weeks jumped heartily onto the development boom by purchasing a large tract of land from Arapaika sawmills with the intention of creating a town of their own. Weeks, the money behind the arrangement, was the owner of a successful turpentine company in Brooksville. The two men immediately drew up plans for the city to be called New Port Richey. Immediately they leaned their efforts toward attracting buyers, but with limited success. A few years later, a disheartened Guilford left the area, his dream to be realized years later by other visionaries. A string of continuing partners poured effort and cash into the venture, until Weeks, his bank account drained, convinced a company led by George Sims to purchase his remaining land. One buyer who came to New Port Richey said she probably would have left if she had had the money to do so. In spite of the difficulties endured by the early founders, Port Richey and much of Pasco County enjoyed a tremendous growth spurt between 1910 and 1920. New stores, homes, and schools were erected. A railroad depot and bridge across the river were constructed to carry goods and people.
The Sass Hotel was more or less, it was a hotel, but it was more like a boarding house. People would come here intending to buy land, and there was no other place. They couldn't just go home when they got here. So the Sass Hotel was where they would go, and the local people came to the Sass Hotel to buy things from their pantry, because there was no grocery store around here.
In 1913, a year after the death of Aaron Richey, Father Felix Ulrich celebrated the first Mass in the western part of the county. The father later went on to found Queen of Peace Catholic Church. In 1913, New Port Richey could claim 20 full-time residents. In 1915, as the community grew, the settlers in New Port Richey built their own post office and officially separated from Port Richey. In 1916, Pine Hill Cemetery was created on 2 acres of land owned by another eminent figure, George Sims. Sims, a land developer, would be responsible for the establishment of civic organizations, parks, and the city's first brick building. Pine Hill, the city's first cemetery, also became the city's first major controversy. Until 1916, the area's black population had been buried at Rose Hill in Tarpon Springs. The creation of Pine Hill resulted in an opportunity to change that forever. But when the idea was broached, the city, local leaders, and residents strongly objected to being buried in the same location as the black populace. However, the 2-acre plot did not rest entirely within the city limits of New Port Richey. One section was actually within the boundaries of Port Richey and fell under that jurisdiction. In the end, a small section was fenced in on the Port Richey side of the cemetery and open to funerals and burials for the area's black residents. By 1921, the city now claimed 1,500 residents, making it one of the largest communities in the area. In October of 1921, a Category 3 hurricane made landfall between Tarpon Springs and New Port Richey. The storm severely damaged the local citrus crop and destroyed many buildings. Our Lady Queen of Peace Church was lifted from its foundation by the strong winds. The church, which had originally faced south, now faced west. But even the forces of nature could not stop the growth. In 1922, city officials decided to create a festival to attract tourists. Postmaster Gerben de Vrie created a mythic fable about the area's previous residents, the Calusa Indians. The Chasco Fiesta, as the festival was called, was an immediate success.
The purpose of Chasco back in 1922 was to build up funds to expand the Newport Richey Library, which was the first library in Pasco County, is independent from the county library system and will remain independent.
It continues to this day, but not without great controversy. Some say the Chasco Fiesta portrays a racist stereotype by perpetrating an outdated and offensive view of Native Americans. One particular group, the crew of Chasco, continues to draw the most fire. The crew, made up mostly of Caucasians and a few Indians, dresses in tribal regalia, some authentic, some far from authentic. It is this portrayal by white people that protesters find offensive. Business and civic leaders point out that the festival, which draws tens of thousands of people into Newport Richey, is a beneficial event for tourism and charities, who receive portions of the money raised. For the hundreds of Indian vendors and dancers, though, the festival, racist or not, provides a way of earning an income. Little did the founders of Newport Richey realize what a controversy they had bred. The years following the first Chasco Fiesta would see the arrival of a new lifeline, as rail service opened in Elfers, allowing for quick transport of the area's abundant citrus crops. New roads made travel easier, and Newport Richey seemed poised for greatness. Opportunity struck when the Newport Richey press reported that many well-known wealthy celebrities had purchased land in the city. Thomas Mann, Irving Berlin, Paul Whiteman, and Sam Harris were among the famous people rumored to take up residence in the city. Thomas Mann had become famous as a golden boy of silent films. He starred in hundreds during his career and was well connected to the elite upper crust of Hollywood and New York. Mann immediately began construction on an elaborate mansion overlooking the Cody River. Thomas Mann envisioned turning Newport Richey into the Hollywood of the South, and began encouraging other stars and celebrities to purchase land or homes in the area. A new extravagant hotel, the Hacienda, opened to regional acclaim.
The Hacienda was actually built to advertise the Mann Theater, which was built by Thomas Mann's brother, and he also was instrumental in the building of the Hacienda.
Its sumptuous interior was designed with taste, culture, and excellent food, all the luxuries a visiting celebrity or dignitary might require. The 50 posh rooms were heated by a state-of-the-art steam-driven boiler. It is said that if you looked closely at the waiters and waitresses attending the stars, you would see a face that would later join the ranks of celebrity. The Reverend Billy Graham would go on to worldwide acclaim, leading a large international ministry. But did he really wait tables at the Hacienda? The real answer is no. The famous religious leader may have worked at a restaurant and certainly attended the Florida Bible Institute, but that would have been well before the school changed its name to Trinity College and moved from Temple Terrace to Newport Richey. The fabulous new Mann Theater opened in July of 1926. It was officially named for Thomas Mann, and the city held its collective breath, awaiting the dawn of a new golden age. Excited citizens circulated rumors around town about exactly which famous celebrities might become their new neighbors. Gloria Swanson, Paul Whiteford, Mary Pickford Rogers, composer Irving Berlin, comedian Raymond Hitchcock. Dozens of authors and stars of film and stage were about to turn the city upside down. Or so it seemed.
They did try to develop this, I think they really did have that dream that this was either going to be the Hollywood of the South or the Hollywood of the East. People have said it different ways. Once talkies came into the films here, we did have the theaters right there on Grand Boulevard, and I really believe that this was going to be the place to go. I mean, it was just, that was their dream, you know, it just never happened.
In the end, only Mann and golfer Gene Sarazen would call Newport Richey home. The dreams of New Port Richey as a filmmaking capital crashed with Wall Street on Black Monday in 1929. The next few years bore witness to closings of local banks, loss of homes, and rampant unemployment as the city grappled with the financial disaster in New York. Any thoughts of New Port Richey becoming a haven of movie stars disappeared as the major film studios struggled to keep operations alive in already well-established Hollywood. One major construction project did continue, though. On Moon Lake, northeast of New Port Richey, a huge hunting lodge and hall were under construction on 7,000 acres of pristine wilderness. Moon Lake Lodge would feature hundreds of cottages and cater to a wealthy clientele of hunters, fishermen, and nature lovers. The extensive grounds were landscaped with exotic flowers and shrubs, while the wilderness areas were stocked with turkey, deer, otter, beaver, and game birds. The lodge opened in August 1933 to great fanfare. Moon Lake Lodge is rumored by many, even today, to have been the site of a Prohibition-era speakeasy and gambling hall. Local legend says that Al Capone, after purchasing a sizable estate on Florida's East Coast, spent considerable time in New Port Richey, gambling tens of thousands of dollars at Moon Lake Lodge. The locals believe a secret casino with illicit liquor existed in the depths of the cavernous club. In a time before surveillance cameras, cheaters were treated especially harsh. Even now, people speak of a large room filled with poker tables and a false ceiling. Above the ceiling, watching the gambling floor, were stationed numerous marksmen behind hidden peepholes. Any would-be cheaters could expect, if caught, to be shot dead on the spot. But did it really happen? Probably not. In fact, during the time Capone was supposedly gambling at Moon Lake Lodge, federal records revealed the gangster was actually imprisoned in Miami on tax evasion charges. New Port Richey and all of Pasco County today is a rapidly growing suburban community made up almost entirely of newcomers. But for the descendants of the original settlers, slaves, and pioneers, the proud history remains as vibrant and real as ever. The West Pasco Historical Society maintains an extensive collection of artifacts portraying the area's rich history. Located in Sims Park, the former two-room schoolhouse was built in 1917. In 1981, it was donated to the Society and moved to its current location. They invite you to visit for more information and to experience the history for yourself. There truly is more to West Pasco County than US 19.